And I am recording this event, so we'll have this for posterity as well. We are expecting at least 30 folks. I have staff who are helping to monitor and make sure everybody has the logins to get in. So we'll be getting that. We'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, everyone. Welcome this evening to our discussion on FDR's proposed Second Bill of Rights. My name, your host, is David Wilson Brown. I'm a candidate for U.S. Congress, Democratic Party nominee for the 5th Congressional District of North Carolina. With us tonight is the esteemed Cass Sunstein. Let me read you his bio a little bit to give him a proper introduction. He is currently the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard. He is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. From 2009 to 2012, he was the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovations Board. Mr. Sunstein has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he has advised officials at the United Nations, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He serves as an advisor to the Behavioral Insights Team in the United Kingdom. Mr. Sunstein is author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness with Richard H. Thaler, Simpler, The Generation of Government, The Ethics of Influence, #Republic, Impeachment, A Citizen's Guide, good to know, The Cost-Benefit Revolution, On Freedom, Conformity, How Change Happens, and Too Much Information. Those are two separate titles. He is now working on a variety of projects involving the regulatory state, sludge, defined to include paperwork and similar burdens, fake news, and freedom of speech. I should note, as a legal scholar, particularly in the fields of constitution law, administrative law, environmental law, and law on behavior economics, Professor Sunstein is said to be the most frequently cited American legal scholar by a wide margin. So that's impressive. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Sunstein. What would you like to say?
Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I should say that on a site, how often I've been cited per page written, I am actually the least cited law professor in the world. That is, I have a lot of pages.
Gotcha.
So, the fact that I have a lot of references may be a product of volume. So many pages.
Yes, certainly. Well, excellent. Well, we're so thrilled to have you here tonight. And the main focus, as you see on your screen, is the book you wrote in 2004, The Second Bill of Rights, FDR's Unfinished Revolution and Why We Need It More Than Ever. I have been a long champion of the Second Bill of Rights. Well, I say long, since January. So let's give a little background. I was invited to go to a small county in our district, Alexander County, to an FDR dinner, which is a very common practice in the Democratic Party. And in research for that, I did a little research on FDR, and I came across his Second Bill of Rights, which previously, despite having been a political science major and been a big fan of history and FDRs, I had been unaware of this. I think many people are unaware of how impactful this proposed Second Bill of Rights is, and that's a big part of what your book is about. In fact, back then you said that you felt like it was a speech defining the Second Bill of Rights was the most important political speech of the 20th century. Do you still feel that way?
I do. I mean, the thing to understand is our country was in double danger during Roosevelt's time. First, as bad as the current economic situation is, in the Depression, it was worse. And a lot of people thought our country and our government couldn't survive. Just the number of people who were not able to get a job, the number of people who were poor, the number of people who were killing themselves because they had no hope.
Mm-hmm.
All of these were really high. And Roosevelt came in and said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Mm-hmm. And he inaugurated a system of government which was basically protective of the most vulnerable. And to think of Roosevelt as both, you can see from the cover, a really good-looking, impressive guy, but also someone who spent most of his adult years in a wheelchair. His legs didn't work. He had polio. So he had acute identification with people all over our country who were struggling. Mm-hmm. And he really wanted to do something about that. And that was basically the first part of his presidency, was trying to create a country that would protect the most vulnerable, either by helping them get jobs or helping them get education, helping them get opportunity, or if none of those was enough, then just giving them resources so they could eat and live somewhere. And then Hitler came along. Mm-hmm. And the country was vulnerable again. And Roosevelt, I think it's reasonable to say Roosevelt saved democracy and freedom through doing a bunch of things, some of them a little bit clever and slightly sneaky, to help England, which was about to get overrun by Germany. And he did it twice. And then Roosevelt, when he was not very healthy, but seeing the arc of his presidency, and this was in, he was elected 4 times, and this is in his last 15 months, he said, what has this all been about? Mm-hmm. I've been through these transformations, mm-hmm. both of national security and of helping the most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And he really worked for a long time with his speechwriters and most trusted advisors to think, what has this been about? And he said, it's all about one thing, security. Mm-hmm. And that security doesn't just mean not being threatened by foreign powers. It means security in yourself, security in your economic situation, security of all kinds. And then he thought and worked with advisors to say, I want to be really ambitious here, said our wheelchair-bound, not young president. I want to say something for the ages. And he said, there's been a political list, the first Bill of Rights, which is really important. And I don't mean to disparage it at all, but we've come to realize that's not enough. Mm-hmm. And that idea that that's not enough for real people led to this world transforming Second Bill of Rights, mm-hmm. which I think you can see as an outgrowth of his effort to respond to human distress, which, as someone who spent years trying to wiggle his small toes, mm-hmm. and he didn't do so good at that, he thought, I don't want this. I don't want this distress. Mm-hmm. And then he thought, how can I summarize it into commitments, moral and political commitments that our democracy should try to live up to?
Mhm.
And, I think Martin Luther King gave Roosevelt a run for his money. Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy did so also.
Mhm.
Um, but if you give me an option of who's the pick of the litter here,
Mhm.
it's Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights.
Mhm. Yeah. And so much of it came out of, as you said, that what he went through in his presidency, what he experienced with his personal battle with polio, and especially someone coming from such great privilege. He definitely came from a very well-off family that he wanted for nothing, and then at the age of 39 was stricken with polio, and then suddenly that defined so much of what he was capable of doing because of the limitations of that disease, especially at that time.
Right.
Um,
It's an incredible story. So you could tell it two different ways, and I think we don't know enough to know which way of telling it is right. One way is that he was a very charming, extremely ambitious, kind of rich guy,
mhm,
who was a little superficial and full of himself.
mhm,
And then he got struck down.
mhm,
And when he got struck down and polio, he tried and tried to be mobile and he just couldn't.
mhm,
The fact that he got struck down made him think, okay, I understand something about human vulnerability and dignity. And basically, my life's going to be about that.
mhm,
And I think that is a very fair understanding of his life's arc. Uh, and Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, thought something like that was probably true.
mhm,
There's an alternative view, which I confess I prefer,
mhm,
which is that there was in his character, even at a very early age, a sense of identification with everyone.
mhm,
Not a sense that, I'm a Roosevelt, I've got money, I'm better, but a sense somewhere in his mind he thought, uh, as some people like to say, I'm not better than anybody and nobody's better than me.
mhm,
Sense of equality. I
mhm,
like to think that from a very young age, he had a commitment to the equal dignity of human beings. And it took stuff like winning to put him in a position to do something about that.
mhm,
And he got really pragmatic and he was funny. So people said, this is a really tough presidency. You got Hitler and you got the Depression kind of in sequence. And some reporters said to him, don't you hate this? Isn't this impossible? Isn't this difficult?
mhm,
And his answer was, look, if you spent 2 years trying to wriggle your big toe, anything else would seem easy.
mhm. Right.
And if you want to capture Roosevelt's, I think, soul, SOUL, that sentence captures it.
Mhm. Yeah, and we were discussing a little before we went live. Um, my kind of a little bit more understanding. I'm not comparing myself to FDR in any way, shape, or form, although we do use DWB for my name all the time. Um, the truth of the matter is that I had a major heart attack Christmas Eve this past year. I had quadruple bypass surgery a few days later. So from my limited privilege, nowhere comparable to Roosevelt's, I also come to it with, I already had the spirit of wanting to lift people up and wanting to support and wanting to make sure that people had an opportunity to succeed, um, and had that starting place, that foundational place. There's a piece in your book where you mentioned about him traveling with Eleanor, whose impact on him had to be significant, when she was doing some work around World War One, where he had to help a sickly boy up a tenement and got to see the squalor in which he lived in, and felt like that was pretty impactful in his life. Did I get that story right?
Completely right.
And that, I think, lends itself exactly to what you're saying for that second view of that, is that he already had it in him, but that may have solidified his vigor and his understanding, because to walk in someone's shoes who goes through that kind of need is completely different than just how you believe. I had great private insurance. I was well covered, but sitting in that hospital bed, I could not help but think, there but for the grace of God go I. What about me has put me in this position where I can survive this, and it's not a financial hardship for my family. My bills would have been over $300,000. So the recognition of that and the understanding of that definitely has put what I've been driving for with Medicare for All for a long time to a finer point. But let's get back to FDR. I don't want to make this.
Roosevelt said in 1944,
Mm-hmm.
the right, this is a part of the Bill of Rights, he thought, to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment.
Right.
And even before that, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health.
Mm-hmm.
That's 1944.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have it yet.
Right.
But that's what he said was part of our Bill of Rights. He also said, by the way, at a time when many of the states of the country he led were racially segregated,
mm-hmm.
he said, this is regardless of race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the recognition of that, of his broad view of it at that age, 76 years ago, finding this second Bill of Rights made me feel like all the stuff that we talk about as a progressive in the progressive party, whatever you define that to be, looks like it comes from this, that this is the seed that planted this. Do you feel that way about the modern progressive movement?
I completely do. And I'd like to think, we have a very diverse country, but there are people who don't consider themselves progressives. Mm-hmm. They might actually think progressives are terrible, mm-hmm. who would read this list and nod mm-hmm. at most of it. The right to a good education. My dad was a Republican, mm-hmm. absolutely for that. Mm-hmm. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment mm-hmm. in our country. My Republican father, not even the slightest doubt. Mm-hmm. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Right.
The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Americans believe in that. We don't live with that.
Right.
That's a tragedy. That's not just words. That's a human, cruelty that people don't have enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. But Americans across partisan lines, a lot of them agree with that. You're clearly right, though, that progressives tend to put a spotlight on these kinds of things.
And look for governmental solutions for delivering them, for doing that. A libertarian friend of mine brought up the discussion about this, about negative rights versus positive rights. How do you feel? And the rights we're discussing are on the screen for everyone. If you have not read, we kind of jumped right into it. Let me go over those real quick before we go into answer that question. But the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. The right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. The right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. And the right to a good education. One of the reasons why I embrace this so much in my campaign is the fact that these are, as you just said, these are not radical ideas. These are ideas that were, proposed by one of our greatest presidents 76 years ago. And so many people reading this list would be, yeah, that sounds right. The question goes to that: how do we as a nation, and you've summarized very well in your book about talking about it being constitutive commitments rather than necessarily amendments to be made.
Right, there's a lot of great points there. So let me talk a little bit about Roosevelt, and then I'll get to the points. So one of Roosevelt's advisors, who'd been with him for a long time, said to one of his younger advisors, you know, he's a really good politician, and he's really clever and funny and informal, but you won't be able to do anything for him unless you realize that when he talks about things like the Second Bill of Rights, he's not kidding. That's where he lives. That's what he cares about. You're going to be useless to him unless you realize that. So that's our guy. In terms of the positive rights, negative rights idea, I'm kind of laughing because Rush Limbaugh has gone hard after me on this issue. It's a little surreal just for a regular person to be attacked by Rush Limbaugh repeatedly, but I'm here to tell you I have been. And here's the source of it. It's in law circles, it's standard to say, this is like usual to say, that our rights are negative rights, like rights against the government. They're not positive rights, rights to help from the government. So we have rights to tell the government, go away. You don't have rights to tell the government, come here. And that's usual. And what Rush Limbaugh said about me is that me, your friend Cass, describes the Bill of Rights as negative rights, meaning bad. Negative meaning bad. No, they're not bad. They're good. They're rights to tell the government, don't lock me up. And so one way of thinking about Roosevelt's Bill of Rights is to say that the first Bill of Rights is negative, meaning government go away, and the second Bill of Rights is positive, meaning government come help me. And that's not a crazy way to think about it. But it's not good enough, and Roosevelt understood this well. So I'm speaking right now from Concord, Massachusetts. I'm speaking actually from a property where the British soldiers came on April 19th, 1775. So you're hearing me right from the place where the American Revolution began. Literally, it began right here. And my place, my little, not so little, not so big property, if someone comes and starts playing on it, running, playing a game, that's called trespass. And it violates my property rights. And I have a right to the government to tell that person, stop trespassing. So does everyone. If you have a pen or pencil and it's taken away, you have a right to get the government help you, meaning stop stealing from me, which is a long-winded way of saying that even the old rights are rights to positive protection from the government. So it's not true to say that the new rights that Roosevelt saw are completely different from the old rights. And Roosevelt said, people who have property, they depend on the government. If you're rich or you're poor, if you own something, what it means to own something is the government will protect you if someone tries to take it away. So Jeff Bezos, who last I checked, he's the richest person in America, I guess, the Amazon guy, all that money is protected by the government. And if the government stopped protecting him, we'd probably lose a lot of it. So this is just a way to say the rights Roosevelt's describing are new, but they're not so different from the old rights. So to say you have a right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, that is a right to government help. But so is the right to private property. The rich people, bless them, they have government help. And that's not a knock on them. It's just a fact. Okay, now this is a fancy word, and I'm not sure I'm glad I used it, but the idea of a constitutive commitment. If you're married, and I'm lucky enough to be married, there's a commitment you make in your marriage to various things. If you're a parent or a child, there are commitments that you make that are part of your relationship with your parents or your kids. If you have a close friend or a best friend, There's something that constitutes the relationship. Like if they're really struggling in life and need to talk to you, you're not going to say, I'm busy. It's a part of the commitment. And so the Second Bill of Rights, as Roosevelt wanted them, as he understood them, he didn't mean to change the Constitution's language. He didn't want to amend the Constitution and put this stuff in there. He wanted to say, these are things that we're committed to. They're part of our nation's identity, which is bigger than some law that says, for example, that you have to wear a mask. Some places have that law. That's a big law. It's important, but it's not part of the identity of our nation. So what Roosevelt wanted to say is, look, the right to adequate education or good education, that's part of what America stands for.
Mm-hmm.
The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age,
mm-hmm.
that's the Social Security Act, by the way, which Roosevelt was responsible for.
Absolutely.
So that's a promise.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, an ordinary law. That goes deeper than that. And so in calling a Second Bill of Rights, he wanted to say, these are national commitments. These are part of what our country is about, which means that if you want to violate them, you are violating something pretty sacred. Not maybe as sacred as the Constitution's text, but still don't mess with that, mm-hmm. Roosevelt was saying.
Mm-hmm. So in saying that, I 100% agree. You do mention in the book specifically that you believe that good public education is universally recognized as a constitutive commitment. Yet, this is the one time I'm going to bring up my opponent. During a congressional hearing this year, June 16th, Virginia Fox is the ranking member of the House Committee on Education and Labor. And she said in that meeting that she is a student of the Constitution and she's read it many, many times, and she fails to find the word education in there. So this is the ranking member of that committee focused on education in the House. And she clearly doesn't see that the general welfare clause is enough to define our commitment as a nation to take care of education.
Okay, so we're maybe back in law school for a moment, and this mm-hmm. is slightly complicated. So mm-hmm. Let's say something that's clear, mm-hmm. which is that even if education isn't part of the U.S. Constitution, mm-hmm. it is part of our self-understanding as a nation. Right. Such that if in North Carolina or in Massachusetts, where I'm speaking from, someone said, good education, no, that's like, a fancy meal at a restaurant. You don't have a right to that. Mm-hmm. That would be pretty wild and cruel talk. Mm-hmm. If it was said, in parts of North Carolina, we're not going to have good education. Mm-hmm. That's a luxury. That's mm-hmm. only for some. Mm-hmm. In fact, they can't even go to school. They have to stay home and watch TV if they have a TV. Mm-hmm. That would be violating what our nation now stands for. Mm-hmm. And Republicans generally agree with Democrats on that. Certainly, President Bush, both of them agreed with that. Okay, on education's constitutional status, if there's discrimination with respect to education of various kinds, there's going to be a serious constitutional problem. Mm-hmm. It's not like spending has to be equal, but there might be some legal problem if spending is crazily unequal. And if there's no education at all, last I checked, the Supreme Court left open the possibility that actually the Constitution forbids that. You have to provide some modicum of education. Mm-hmm. So to say flatly education isn't in our Constitution is not fair mm-hmm. to how our Constitution is now understood. Mm-hmm. And even if it has some technical accuracy in it, mm-hmm. It's a betrayal mm-hmm. of the nation's deepest understandings since 1944.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So The other big thing that I have kind of driven in both my candidacies in the last election and this election is the idea, recognizing the job losses that we have in America, largely coming from automation and AI and not from immigration, from the movement forward of technology. I've long advocated for a modern jobs program, like not unlike the WPA, to address our gross infrastructure needs, but also our environmental needs. Do you believe that the federal jobs program, that the type that Roosevelt championed and got us through that, especially in light of the need for recovery from this pandemic, would be a good idea and would be honoring the spirit of the right to remunerative job?
Yes. Well, let's start right there. The Roosevelt second bill, and it's worth pausing over the largeness of what Roosevelt is talking about. This isn't a policy. This is a right.
Right.
The right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. So that's the first that he lists here. Mm-hmm. You could produce that right in various ways. Mm-hmm. So in the circumstances of the Great Depression and in current circumstances, mm-hmm. it's going to be really hard to do that relying only on private sector growth. Mm-hmm. That's going to be really hard. Right. So the argument for infrastructure and other programs of multiple kinds mm-hmm. to ensure that people have the dignity of work mm-hmm. Is really strong. Mm-hmm. So this is a way of saying yes to your question, mm-hmm. meaning that it's in the spirit of Roosevelt's second bill and also in the spirit of the New Deal itself, right. to say something about the dignity of work. And those are words, but I'm sure everyone who's listening has either personally had the experience or knows someone close who's had the experience of job loss. And losing the money that's tough. But also, not having a place to go to work, or to work rather than to go in the in the era of Zooming. Not to have work is a humiliation. And Roosevelt was acutely aware of that. And if people have a job, doing something that helps the streets and highways get better for people, or that makes the environment cleaner, or does something, mm-hmm. then they go to night. Then all of us get to go to bed at night saying we contributed to our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my intent would be to put people to work in their own communities, benefiting these issues that the communities need, whether it be a clean energy initiative to help power their area of the country, to expand rural broadband, since internet access is quickly becoming viewed as a potential right in the digital age. So many of these things that we could address, and it's going to take the government to step in that place where corporate profit motive doesn't exist or is hard to find.
Yes. And it's probably good to emphasize that Roosevelt was a big defender of the free enterprise system. And he thought, this is the core of our economy. Mm-hmm. And so he once said, I don't know why the rich people hate me so much. I'm just trying to stop them from throwing themselves off buildings.
Right.
Trying to get the economy to be strong and inclusive so that we wouldn't have despair that would hit often the wealthy because their companies would go under. So to have a large role for the private sector, to have incentives and subsidies of various sorts, that's undoubtedly part of the picture. Mm-hmm. But in some contexts, you're completely right. The government needs to be doing it. Think of the numerous people who are doing amazing work, whether we're talking about police or fire or sanitation. And every day, the fact that things are as good as they are for at least many of us is not because the government stayed away. It's because the government's around to help us if there's a leak in the water. Where I live right now, there's a problem with the water. And government workers were on it in a heartbeat, and they fixed it in 8 hours. That's necessary.
Right. Yeah. So we have some questions that have come up. They're in the chat. Wesley Davis asks, is the most powerful argument in modern American politics against policies that supports Roosevelt's vision rooted in this laissez-faire economic anti-government philosophy? Furthermore, do you find this particularly problematic in rural conservative areas that are rooted in the individualistic Protestant work ethic?
It's a great question. So, if my eyes are wandering, it's because I'm reading the text.
Mhm.
So, the individualist Protestant work ethic is part of what has made and continues to make our country great.
Mhm.
So, if that's flourishing in rural conservative areas, hooray for that.
Mhm.
The laissez-faire economic anti-government philosophy, no hooray for that. And
Mhm.
the reason is that people who raise the flag of laissez-faire and argue against government intervention
Mhm.
depend on it every day of every year.
Absolutely.
The people who celebrate laissez-faire are the people who have most to lose if
Mhm.
they got what they're celebrating.
Mhm.
That is, if people in wealthy communities, speaking of laissez-faire, lost government, then they're going to have to hire
Mhm.
a private police force, private fire protection, and good luck with that.
Mhm.
That's really hard.
Mhm.
So we don't have a system of laissez-faire, even in the areas that seem to. There's a robust government which is protecting lots of things. That's great. Try to have a system of free expression. If you don't have a government stopping people from beating you up because of your point of view,
Right.
and the government will help you most of the time if you're at risk of getting punched in the nose because of your political beliefs.
Mhm.
And that's true for all of us. We need government there.
Well, and that goes to the basis for Obama's much maligned comment about you didn't build that, meaning the framework of America that these businesses are built upon. They couldn't get their stuff to market if it weren't for the publicly funded roads. They couldn't, as you said, have the security that the police force provides. All these elements are there that this business was built upon. The education of the workers is a big component of that. That gets disregarded as the benefits of how they can make the money that they make.
So we can celebrate the achievements of the entrepreneur who builds up, let's say, a little cafe around the corner. And I'm thinking of an entrepreneur right around my corner,
Mm-hmm.
the fantastic little cafe. Doesn't make a lot of money, but makes enough, I hope, I think, and also just makes the community better.
Mm-hmm.
And the big entrepreneurs like, you know, Steve Jobs, who make zillions of money. We can celebrate what they do while also saying that good luck doing that in a system of laissez-faire.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been, I think, not possible.
Mm-hmm. Right. Question from Kimberly. When FDR said a right to education, do you feel he meant a debt-free education? At what point
No,
does...
he didn't spell it out, and that's kind of one of the beautiful features.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Kimberly, for that. One of the beautiful features of the Second Bill of Rights, like the First Bill of Rights, we don't know if the freedom of speech includes commercial advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's not clear from the text.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he meant that people who had money to go to college
Mm-hmm.
would have a right to government funding of their education. He never said that, and I'd be surprised if he thought that. Just speaking of Roosevelt personally. And what a good education entails, he left ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't mean, a PhD in French literature. He meant something like a good education that enables you to be a fully functioning member of society.
Mm-hmm.
And that will vary across the years. So there was a time for my parents, I remember they were slightly surprised or impressed or amazed to learn that someone they just met went to college.
Mhm.
They went to college, but this was a time when going to college was uh, relatively rare, I think, at least among the people they knew. By relatively rare, I don't mean 1 in 100, but not 99 in 100 or not 75 in 100. But now there are places where if you, really not going to college is an economic problem for you because most people did.
Mhm.
And so it may be now right to say, as some people say, that the right to a good education does include a right to go to college. And I think some version of that is actually correct.
Mhm.
Debt free, it depends on, that would be a very ambitious thing to say. So, to say you have to incur a little bit of debt, that's not the worst thing in the world.
Mhm. Okay. Um, so good comment from Allie Akers, who's on our staff. Thanking you for writing the book and watching the documentary on Henry Wallace. Uh, she's inspired to, and just so you know, she is a rising freshman in college involved, a superstar that you'll hear a lot from, I'm sure. But she says that you have helped inspire to make FDR's dream a reality.
Thank you for that, Ali. You and me both.
From Kyle Allen, she says, experience makes all the difference in the second Bill of Rights, or you said, experience makes all the difference in the second Bill of Rights would not have been possible without experience of the Depression. Do you think that the COVID pandemic experience could be the most opportune time to try again?
What a great question. Okay, so here's, I think yes is the answer.
Mhm.
So let's think a little bit about rights, where they come from.
Mhm.
Often rights as we live them come from an experience of wrongs.
Mhm.
So where I'm speaking from now, Concord, uh, in my old house, the previous owner found letters in the attic from like 1752 complaining about things about the king.
Mhm.
No complaints about the king. The handwritten letters.
Mhm.
Um, and, our whole system is prohibiting anything like monarchy.
Mhm.
And the system of self-government that we have that forbids titles of nobility and allows freedom of speech and all sorts of other things, those grew out of concrete experience with wrongs. And the COVID pandemic experience, I think it is a time to think, what made this happen? And what kind of rights and institutions can we put in place that make sure it doesn't happen again? Or if it happens again, it doesn't have the devastating effects. So the fact that we've had more than 100,000 of our fellow citizens die from this is a uh, is a tragedy, but also is an inspiration
Mhm.
to say something like never again. So there's no question that uh, that Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, it sings a little more loudly today than it did a year ago,
Yeah.
because we're seeing, in real time, in ways we didn't a year ago,
Mhm.
what it means not to have adequate medical care or the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health,
Mhm.
or what it means not to have a useful and remunerative job. We're seeing that more vividly than we have in a while.
Well, and I think it really underlines the maybe not mistake is a good word, but the dangers inherent in pairing our healthcare with our employment. And when you have a time when so many were very quickly lost their jobs, millions, um, potentially losing their health insurance along with their jobs is a double blow. Uh, Especially in a time of a pandemic when healthcare is at such a premium and such a concern.
Right. I'm thinking that most people on the call probably know people who either lost their jobs connected with the pandemic or something went wrong for them, such that the employer provided health care isn't there. And there is an opportunity through Obamacare to get health care. And the question is, how easy is it and how good is it? How much does it work?
Mm-hmm.
It shouldn't be the case that significant numbers of Americans lack health insurance. That's just uh, too devastating.
Mm-hmm.
And it is doable to have changes in the system such that basically, the overwhelming majority, let's say, of Americans don't have to worry about the choice between healthcare, economic devastation, and health. That's not a choice that any one of us should face.
Mm-hmm. The question from Cindy Brady is, when promoting the concept of the Second Bill of Rights, what was the reaction from the Republicans?
It wasn't positive. So the country was so in love with Roosevelt and so preoccupied with the war, and that the Republican reaction wasn't, this is the worst thing in the world, horrible. But some Republicans did say, what's wrong with the first Bill of Rights?
Mm-hmm.
And, there isn't a problem here. What are you doing? They didn't use the S word and say socialist,
Mm-hmm.
but they did say, so far as I recall, they didn't use that word, but they did say this is a foreign kind of thing. This isn't what America's about. And that's a completely fair argument to have.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to emphasize that Roosevelt didn't mean to disparage the first Bill of Rights, not in any way,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, we've come to recognize that necessitous people are not free people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. The COVID-19 pandemic makes that, very visible, that if people are desperate because of their economic situation or they need health care, they are lacking an important kind of freedom, even if technically they can complain or practice their religion. Still, they're not fully free.
Yeah, I mean, the recognition for sure that the he saw it as the root to the rise of the fascism that was going on there was that necessity, that freedom from want. Freedom from want is to me, he talked about the four pillars of freedoms prior to the Second Bill of Rights, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. How do you define freedom from want, and how? Because I think that would be one that the more conservative view would have the most struggle with. How do you define it? How far do you define want? And would maybe a freedom from need be maybe a cleaner?
And all of these have definitional challenges.
Right.
So, freedom of speech, does that include bribery, criminal solicitation, criminal conspiracy? Probably the answer to all of those is no. Does it include sexually explicit speech? Does it include libel? Does it include false commercial advertising? Does it include lies about whether COVID-19 is real? These are things that people argue about. So the fact that there's a definitional challenge isn't a reason not to have a right, because if it were a reason not to have a right, then we wouldn't have any rights, because we're always going to have some definitional challenges. In terms of freedom from want, what Roosevelt meant by that was need. So it wasn't like, I want to have, a chocolate cake right now, and I have a right to that. It wasn't want in the sense of desire. It was want in the sense of, basic necessities. So the idea, which many of our states recognize in one or another form, is that if you don't have food, or if you don't have a place to live, or if you don't have clothing, there's a violation of something. And whether you call it a right or not is something we could discuss. Roosevelt wanted to say that in order to have a decent human life, sometimes it's cold. You need clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And if maybe the best way to get there is through reliance on the private sector. And maybe that can do it all if you're lucky. That would be surprising.
Mm-hmm.
So probably it's not going to do it all. It'll probably do most.
Mm-hmm.
But then what are you going to do about the people who don't get clothing?
So I did
right to light. Shall I turn on a light? Will that help?
That might help. Yeah.
I'm going to give you a little more light.
No problem. Hey. So I did want to.
The importance of rights. This is the third Bill of Rights.
Right.
The right to a speaker who is not in darkness.
I do want to quote from your book. There's to kind of end us here. You mentioned that there was a proposed constitutional amendment in 2003 that kind of enumerated a lot of these rights, but then you kind of rewrote them in this way. And I'm going to read those because I think it's interesting to see them in this context. You had Section 1, every citizen has the right to a good education. Pretty straightforward from there. Section 2, every citizen has the right to adequate protection in the event of extreme need stemming from illness, accident, old age, or unemployment. Section 3, every citizen has the right of access to adequate food, shelter, clothing, and health care. Section 4, every citizen has the right to a chance at I can never say this word, remunerative employment. Section 5, every citizen has the right to freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. And Section 6, Congress and state governments must take reasonable legislative and other measures within available resources to achieve the realization of these rights. I think that capstone, that piece that pulls it all together is necessary to kind of justify how that moves from a negative to a positive to a negative. I don't know. How do you feel that is the important?
Okay, so if North Carolina or South Carolina or Iowa or Minnesota was debating whether to have something like a second Bill of Rights,
Mm-hmm.
to recognize that we don't have all the money
Mm-hmm.
there might be,
mm-hmm.
and that resources are limited,
mm-hmm.
that there's lots of things the taxpayers are paying for.
Mm-hmm.
That's completely fair.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that there's a special obligation on the part of public officials to protect these interests
mm-hmm.
or rights,
mm-hmm.
I'd say rights,
mm-hmm.
is a good path forward
mm-hmm.
in a divided country
mm-hmm.
in which many of our fellow citizens are suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And to recognize the rights while also saying that their protection has to be brought about through the means that are reasonably available
mm-hmm.
is a way to meet the legitimate concern
mm-hmm.
that we got a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's important to recognize, you talked about the Republicans of the time seeing it as kind of a foreign approach to rights or something not part of the American makeup, the individualistic American makeup, right? So many countries after World War II took these and made, that's a big part of what you talk about in this book, is that so much of what we consider the UN, so much of the human rights, universal human rights, all these components that have sprung from this vision. And that's why you classified that speech as so important to the 20th century. But the recognition that we in America have not taken that step and somehow put this into legislative sense to make this required. And it goes to my opponent's comment about, well, education's never mentioned in the Constitution. And if you're going to be, as many of them are, a strict constitutionalist and feel like the government shouldn't have a place in things that are not specifically spelled out in the Constitution. I think that would redefine what we consider America.
Well, if she says education isn't mentioned in the Constitution, so there isn't a right to that. Mm-hmm. Campaign expenditures aren't mentioned in the Constitution. So that means she thinks there isn't a right to that.
Right.
The commercial advertising isn't mentioned. I mean, there's not a right to that. Mm-hmm. The right not to be sterilized isn't mentioned. The right not to be racially segregated isn't mentioned. The right not to be discriminated against on the basis of sex isn't mentioned. Does that mean all of those aren't part of the Constitution? Mm-hmm. The list of things that are universally understood to be part of the Constitution now, many of them are not explicitly mentioned, and that's because the Constitution isn't endless. Mm-hmm. It's short. It leaves things either open or implicit. Mm-hmm. I would say that you're completely right that Roosevelt's speech has had a massive worldwide impact, and a good one. But also it does grow out. So it's a leading American export. Mm-hmm. It's like the iPhone, mm-hmm. maybe even better than the iPhone as an export. But it's also the case that the Second Bill of Rights grows out of thinking that goes back to the founding, mm-hmm. where Madison and Jefferson spoke of the right to help people who are indigent. They didn't hate that. They mm-hmm. thought that was a responsibility. Mm-hmm.
And that's also been my struggle with trying to pitch people on a universal healthcare in America, that I struggle to get them to understand that historically our private healthcare system is much newer than, people want to think it is. And the idea that preceding the monetization of, healthcare insurance, there was a belief in America and potentially elsewhere in the world that healthcare is a right. And it was only once we got to the point that it became monetized, it then became was taken more out of people's hands.
You know more about this than I do. The only point I'd add is that there's broad recognition now that whatever the role of the private sector and government, mm-hmm. There is a right to healthcare. Mm-hmm. So if a Republican candidate said, I don't believe there's a right to healthcare, mm-hmm. if you have a pre-existing condition and the insurance company denies you insurance, that's fine. Mm-hmm. You're just going to have to do without insurance. Mm-hmm. That would be a very provocative thing to say.
Right. Excellent. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour. I want to, with all my heart, thank you for being here. That this has been a sublime discussion and really one of the coolest highlights of anything I've done during this campaign. I may be disparaging to too many people by saying that, but this has really been a pleasure. Is there any closing comment that you would like to make?
I'd like to say two things. First, thank you so much for hosting me and for your commitment to public service. That's completely inspiring. And second, with respect to everyone there, whatever your political affiliation, whoever you're going to vote for, make sure you and everyone you know, please will you do this? Make sure you and everyone you know does one thing, votes.
Yep. And that's an awesome way to end it. Thank you so much, Professor Sunstein. It really has been a pleasure. Thank you everyone who joined us for your great questions. This has really been a really special event. We will post the recording of this live post the recording of this to our Facebook and other means. And if I can do anything in the future for you, Professor, just let me know, and it would be really my pleasure.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic evening. Thank you for joining us. And I think we're going to end it here tonight. Of course, Professor Sunstein is going, but I think we've covered so much tonight. It's been really a pleasure, and I think we're going to end it there. And check in. We will have a Ask DWB Anything this Thursday at 7 p.m., so you can check that out. and hope to see you around as much as possible in the age of COVID. Stay safe, keep your families and friends safe, and as he said, don't forget to vote. Thank you.